Okay, that was wonderful. Our next speakers are Evelyn Makouet, Manager, Studies and Statistics at SHQ, and Makouet Demars, Economist and Project Leader at ACOM. Ms. Makouet holds a degree in Statistics and a Master's in Demography from the Catholic University of Louvain-la-Neuve in Belgium, and she's also worked for almost 10 years at the Société Habitation du Québec as the head of the Statistics Department and head of the Department of Research and Statistics. She's also been an expert advisor on statistics and information systems related to income security to the Ministry of Employment and Social Solidarity and worked at the Treasury Board Secretariat as a senior advisor on statistical methods, prospective studies, and comparative evaluation of employment and employee compensation structures of the public and private sector. Ms. Demars holds a Bachelor of Business Administration in Finance and a Master's in Applied Economics. She works as Chief Economist in the Planning, Urbanism, and Economics team at ACOM, and she has extensive expertise in cost-benefit, financial and socio-economic analysis, as well as economic impact studies. Her experience covers a multitude of projects completed within ACOM, mainly in the sectors of transportation, urban, rural, rail, and air, housing, urban and recreational development, and energy. She is also recognized for her expertise in econometric and statistical analysis, which she's in particular applied in the context of the study to estimate the monetary value of the social impacts of SHQ activities. I'd like to welcome Ms. Makouet and Ms. Demars.
Alors, bonjour à tous.
Good morning, everyone. It is with great interest and enthusiasm that we're contributing to this session on the impact assessment of housing. We are going to be outlining the activities of the Société d'Habitation du Québec, the Quebec Housing Authority. The Société d'Habitation du Québec has a mission that of facilitating the access of Quebecers to adequate housing, taking into account their financial resources and the diversity of their needs. Our mission and our action are very socially useful because our aim, mainly but not exclusively, is to help low-income families and rural populations that have difficulty finding housing. The SHQ, therefore, is an important element in the social safety net of Quebec. We're going to be making a presentation. I'll be doing this in tandem with Makouet Demars, who was just introduced to you. So first of all, we will outline for you the context of the study. And given that this study was carried out in two phases, we'll present the first phase, in other words, the objectives, the economic impacts, the social impacts, and the territorial impacts. And phase two has three steps. We'll be outlining the objectives, the reduction of poverty, homelessness, seniors, people with disabilities, and people suffering from mental illness. So that gives you the brief outline. I'll present some of the elements of our concept to explain why the SHQ undertook this study. So first of all, the background. We were experiencing a world economic crisis. There was also a reduction of public spending in all areas. The population was aging, and the public and political decision makers believed that social housing is just an expense. That was the context. Despite the fact that social housing for society plays an important role. We accept this, we who work in the area of housing, but generally, people consider that it's an expense, and its only impact is in the service rendered in and of itself. We also wanted to look at the general and broad impact of our assistance, given that it extends far beyond our clientele. We see impacts on the family and in the immediate environment, also for the community and Quebec society overall. So it is in this context that the SHQ wanted to measure the impact of the help and assistance it provides and demonstrate its social worth as well as the impacts for society. The impact study was therefore, as I said, led in 2 phases with different methodologies. The first phase took place in 2011 using data from 2010 to 2011. This was data compiled by the SHQ. And in this phase, we analyzed the economic, territorial, and social activities of the Housing Authority. The second phase took place in 2013. We used data from 2011-2012 to analyze the expenditures that Quebec society did not have to incur thanks to the SHQ's interventions. To achieve these 2 phases, the SHQ called upon ACOM, an international firm that offers technical support to professionals engaged in government services, engineering, territory management, etc. And Emmanuelle, during her part of the presentation, will be able to give you a better idea of ACOM's mandate if she so wishes. So the first phase of our study, its objectives were mainly to determine the economic impact of the activities of the SHQ, the social impacts, and the territorial impacts. So I will now call upon Emmanuelle, who was responsible for choosing the methodologies and systems in the first phase, and then I'll come back to you to outline the objectives of this second phase of our study. I'm not chief economist, I must correct you. Perhaps, hopefully, I will hold that position, but it's not yet the case. So I must pay tribute to the chief economist. Yes, we are an international caliber firm, consulting firm, but we have all sorts of expertise in support of us for infrastructure projects. So we have sociologists, anthropologists, etc., who support us. And this was a wonderful example of cooperation amongst a multidisciplinary team within the company, because we called upon mainly economists, but also sociologists and anthropologists, as I said. Given the project, or based on what the project has as its aim, we can choose the composition of our team. So that's my little promo blurb. With regard to our study, the economic impact, the first study, I'll give you an overview, but honestly, I was very involved in the second one, less in the first one, so I'll outline the methodology and the results, but I will dwell more on the second study, which to my mind was more innovative. So for the first one, the study began with a study of the economic impacts. So if you're comfortable with the term, what this means is that with the intersectoral model of the Institute of Statistics of Quebec, we carried out a simulation when there's an economic shock, a new influx of money. What does it stimulate in the Quebec economy? In particular, the first step was to identify the types of expenditures from SHQ might be transferred into economic activities. So there were 2 steps. First of all, goods and services. When you inject money, there's a new demand of goods and services. And the other aspect was residential construction. You stimulate an industry. So the methodology, that was the one used. And it's the SHQ that took care of the simulation, but the first step was to identify the expenses and expenditures of the SHQ that could be used within the model. For 2010-2011, there were grants of $608 million. About a third of these monies went to goods and services and households. The two other thirds was for stimulating residential construction. What's important to underscore is this. You must know this, but when the SHQ intervenes, it doesn't do so alone. The municipalities contribute to CMHC, so there were $1.4 billion in all that were invested in the industry for social housing, community housing, etc. All of the SHQ's injections in the economy. So when the SHQ injects $1, in fact, $2.30 are injected into the Quebec economy. Now the results, what we see is that 60% of these monies are value added. So we're talking about $854 million that are directly attributable to our GDP. It's very economic. If you have questions afterwards, so don't hesitate. We also look at manpower, labor. We're talking about 11,000 person years. So over 11,000 full-time jobs are created. They're not necessarily generated, but they're attributed to these actions. To give you a better idea, if you look at the direct jobs in residential construction for a year, we're talking about 4,000 direct jobs. If you look at the total of the expenditures in residential construction in Quebec for 1 year, it's about 10% of that. So we can say that the SHQ's activities account for about 10% in residential construction expenditures over a year. So that gives you an idea of the economic fallout of these interventions. Eveline, if you want to intervene, please feel free to do so. For the second part, we looked at social impacts. Here, the exercise was really a literature review and interviews. So it's really a qualitative analysis. There's no quantification that was done at this level. There was an immense effort to organize the information because the SHQ has all sorts of programs targeting various issues. So the first idea was to identify the social issues. We identified 7: poverty, homelessness, immigration, health, seniors and people with disabilities, Aboriginal populations, and social cohesiveness. So all of the SHQ's programs intervene or address these issues at one point or another. The major effort that was done was based on the internal data of the SHQ and expert studies. The idea was to identify for each one of the programs to whom it is addressed, who it targets, how it contributes to the clientele, and what the issues are. So in the end, we had a matrix with 25 social impacts. I won't list them all here. You've got a few examples. But what is important to retain is that these were classified based on the customer base, the clientele, by community, and for Quebec society as a whole. So we have 4 issues classified per clientele, client group. So an example, for example, for the poverty theme, what we identified were naturally positive impacts on available disposable income with all of the programs, subsidized housing. I've got a whole list of acronyms here, but they're rent assistance or allowance programs, help for households, etc. All of this targets households or individuals, more broadly the community. We're talking here about a reduction of socioeconomic inequality. And for Quebec society as a whole, we can say that fixed housing reduces moving, enhances conditions that lead to better education, etc. So society as a whole benefits from this. So that gives you an idea of all of the impacts and where they can be found and tracked. And it's this matrix that served as the basis for the second study that it targeted quantifying the benefits more particularly. With regard to territorial impacts, here too, this was a more qualitative analysis. There was a bit of quantification, but our aim was to compare the distribution of low-income households throughout Quebec, compare this to the activities of the SHQ. And secondly, the idea was to look at the intervention of SHQ in Nunavik, so its involvement in that northern territory. So the major observations drawn from this study, we can say that yes, the SHQ has a balanced approach over the territory if we're talking about the ratio of social housing to low-income families. With regard to rural areas, yes, the SHQ is filling a void in the private sector. The cost of materials and labor are too high, so it's very difficult to offer housing to low-income households at an affordable price. So the intervention of the SHQ is very important. Same thing in Nunavik, because there are higher property values in some regions, including that region. There's also intensification. We facilitate a better social mix when we intervene in our cities, heading off the gentrification of the popular boroughs. In Hochelaga-Maisonneuve, we looked at the value of residential areas compared with the average, the increase in the municipal assessment. And those who benefit from the program saw an increase of 33% on average. And the average, without taking that into account, was 27%. Finally, for Nunavik, it's a very special region north of the 55th parallel. There are 12,000 people. Most of them are Inuit. There are 14 villages, and in that region, the intervention of the SHQ is essential because we consider, or rather we know, that more than 90% of the population lives in SHQ housing units. So this is one of the elements that made our task very difficult when we had to quantify the impact, because there was no comparison. We couldn't imagine what the situation would be without the SHQ. And I'll come back to that in the second study overview. So that's a rapid review of the first study. I'll now give the floor back to my colleague, Evelyne. So the first phase of the study allowed us to demonstrate that social housing is an investment rather than an expense. We have already said that you have to see housing as an investment. So this allowed us to raise awareness within society and combat prejudice. In brief, the first phase of our study had a very positive impact. It was essential to raise awareness in society, generally speaking, and in decision-making milieu, because it's very important to understand all of the impacts. This gave us immense visibility. It allowed us to clarify our mission with Quebecers, because often people confuse our mission with that of other organizations that work in the same field. By demonstrating the importance of our role, we were able to raise awareness in society to the fact that when you help the poorest, you're not just acting by compassion. You also are doing something that's very worthwhile for society. On the basis of the success of this phase, we wanted to go further and delve further in measuring the impact of our activities. And this led to phase 2 of this study. So the second phase, well, the first phase allowed us to quantify some of the impacts, but it was a partial quantification. So we wanted to delve further into these impacts and determine what Quebec society saves when the government intervenes in housing. It's based on these objectives that we called upon the same firm, the firm that my colleague works with, ICOM. So I'll call upon her yet again to outline the methodology, the approaches, and the results obtained.
Okay, donc.
So for the second study, in fact, there was really this will to put numbers behind the words. The SHQ was saying that housing isn't a cost but an investment, but it wanted to have more than words. It wanted to back its words up with numbers. So we had a wonderful challenge, that of quantifying the social impacts of the activities of the SHQ. And we had a limited time frame for this. So the first thing we did was to meet a maximum of experts in the field to determine what data was already out there. It was clear that we didn't have the time to do empirical studies, to go on the ground and carry out studies like that of Dr. Dunn. We would have loved to have been able to do that, but it wasn't at all included in the scope or mandate that we had. So we simply wanted to know what was out there and what work we could do. So we met with experts in the field. For homelessness, we met with the police. For homelessness as well, we looked at initiatives like the at-home program. Those are just examples, but this is what led us to realize what we would be able to do under our mandate. I mentioned earlier that the impacts can play out on 3 levels. The clientele directly targeted, the community, or Quebec society overall. For poverty, we wanted to be able to quantify up to a certain extent the impact on households receiving social housing, so an improvement in their quality of life. And for the other clienteles, it was more at a macro level. So for Quebec society, the savings that society would make thanks to social housing. So there are 2 completely different approaches that we used, but they did deliver very interesting results. So I'll start with the reduction of poverty. So less poverty, that was the issue. And the first question, well, how do you define poverty? And secondly, how do you assess whether or not you succeeded in reducing it? So there are 2 measures that are currently used in Quebec. It's the low income cutoff and consumer baskets. The methodology is based on a study that had previously been done in public health. So that's where we drew our inspiration from. We reproduced the model. But the interest of the consumer basket is that you can cut it up into several baskets. It gives you the minimum that should be expended in each distinct basket. So the first step was to create, based on the survey of consumer spending in 2009, we wanted to set affordability ratios. We looked at the 3 major consumer baskets, so food, clothing, and transportation. And based on these affordability ratios, we were able to determine by revenue quintile to what extent households were able to cover their needs. And this graph shows you the numbers. These are the only numbers we'll be presenting to you, but it's interesting to see that in the first quintile, the first 3 bars, with the exception of transportation, which is the gray bar, the other 2 are well below the minimum level. The dotted line is the limit at which households do have the means to spend the minimum for the basket. With regard to food, the green, they're at 67%, and clothing, they're at 63%. So everything that's below, we consider that it's below the poverty line. That is how we define poverty. Based on that, we wanted to determine the effort to be made in order to determine how the intervention could target those baskets. We were looking at a broad clientele, and it didn't just include people who lived in subsidized housing. There were diplomats involved. There were all sorts of clienteles, so it wasn't reliable for the purposes of our study. So we said that the effort rate is what we aim for when we subsidize housing. So we wanted to establish a link between the effort to be made and an improvement for self-sufficiency. But it wasn't clear in the case of people benefiting from social housing. So we developed an econometric model, and we looked at the composition of households, and we used a maximum of variables available in the survey of households. We had various tests to determine if there was statistical cohesiveness, and once we were able to say that, yes, when we reduce the effort rate, there's an increase of X of the affordability ratio of a consumer basket, we had an idea of our impact, and then we could apply it to the real clientele of the SHQ. So we transposed this, thanks to the internal data held by SHQ, which is Evelyn's department. As a matter of fact, we had a good picture of the subsidized housing households and those households that benefited from the rent allowance program. We were able to determine to what extent we were able to reduce their effort rate and therefore the impact of our help. With regard to results now, overall, we concluded that, or rather we limited ourselves to households earning less than $30,000 a year, because that's the majority of our clientele for these programs. I think it's more than 90% of our customer base, client base, and that's where the impact is the highest with regard to affordability ratios for food, clothing, and transportation. So we calculated that overall, users spent $152 million more per year for those three baskets, $90 million for food, $18 million for clothing, and $44 million for transportation. This represents additional disposable income worth $1,800 per household. What's important to mention here is that, yes, clearly, subsidization is automatically additional disposable income for households, but it wasn't clear that this disposable income was automatically going to be used for essential purchases. And we saw that, yes, indeed, a very high portion of this is devoted to essential goods. So that was good news. Coming back to our graph of earlier, with regard to the affordability ratio for food, for example, about 16% is the improvement. So if we saw that they were at 67%, and there's an additional 16%. It's not total sufficiency, but it's pretty close. For clothing, it's an extra 16%, and for transportation, it's 25% extra. So that was our way of saying that our way of measuring the reduction of poverty is indeed very convincing, thanks to these programs. For the other programs now, the approach was completely different, as I said. So our approach was really based on Quebec society as a whole. Here again, we began with a review of literature and interviews, and this allowed us to collect data on the costs avoided by client type. And we separated each clientele individually. We did estimates for each one. And what we were seeking to quantify was, for example, in the case of homelessness, the costs. And every time we were thinking, what would happen were it not for the SHQ? So if a homeless person didn't have this housing unit, where would he or she be? So, for example, oops, I skipped too quickly to the results. For homelessness, we based our action on the Chez Soi program. For those of you who aren't familiar with it, it was an experience that was funded by the Canadian government over 5 years. There were 2,500 participants, and half of them were drawn. We provided housing and a lot of services to those whose names were drawn, and we followed them over 5 years' time. Everything was quantified, the number of occurrences, police interventions with the target group and the control group, the nights spent in shelters, in jail, in dry-out centers, etc. So they were able to establish the cost savings depending on whether or not a homelessness person benefited or not from the program. So we used those costs, we adjusted them, and we were able to conclude that with regard to the homelessness client group, the SHQ allowed Quebec to save $2.3 million. So the savings were, as I said, $2.3 million. For the three other groups, seniors who are semi-independent, disabled, and those suffering from mental illness, we looked at a scenario whereby if they didn't have the housing unit offered, well, we wanted to estimate the proportion of those people who would be in institutionalized care. And the average was about 15,000 per individual who would have to be housed in an intermediary situation. So those were the savings we were able to estimate for that group. There are other savings that we calculated, but we didn't include them because they weren't as clear-cut. For example, for accommodation or adaptation programs for people with disabilities, less injuries, for example, less hospitalizations. We didn't include this in the final results because it wasn't as solid scientifically, but definitely there are other savings that are out there. I think that about covers what I had to tell you with regard to that aspect. This is a study that we found extremely interesting to do because it forced us to reflect on various elements. Nothing similar had been done, and we wanted to see what data was out there, what data we could use that was already available. With regard to the usefulness of the study, I will call upon Evelyn, but concerning the limitations of the assessment, we were chatting earlier with someone from Statistics Canada, and one thing that I noted is that there aren't enough surveys with specific variables linked to social housing. So it would be good to look at our results over time. All of our results are static over a one-year period, but we would need longitudinal studies to look at the full impact, and we couldn't find anything, at least anything that was accessible to us in that regard. Empirical studies, well, there are several programs out there. With regard to the health theme, we had no conclusions there, but there are several studies out there underway. They're very promising. Maybe they've wound up since this was done in 2013, but this is part of the limits. The time frame. We didn't have enough time to look at the evolution of the results under the various studies beyond the one-year period. I think I'll stop there and I'll call upon Evelyn to conclude, and then I'll be here if you have questions. Thank you, Emmanuel. As I mentioned earlier, the study allowed us to conclude that the government should continue to invest in social housing. We were able to demonstrate that social housing is indeed an investment rather than an expense, and social housing is an opportunity for all. And we must raise awareness of society as to the benefits we can all derive from these housing-related policies and interventions. Nothing is perfect. However, there are challenges in Quebec society, challenges to overcome. We have to better define our budget challenges, our social challenges. This was a very inspiring process. Housing gives impetus to achieve economic, social, and territorial growth, and it's beneficial for all because it shows the social usefulness of social housing and investments in it. That concludes our presentation. There are documents pertaining to both phases of the study on the website. All of this documentation is available in both languages on our site. Thank you for your attention. If you have questions.
Thank you very much, Evelyn and Emmanuel, for your very interesting and informative presentation. I'll have to keep in mind some of what you put forward in our own evaluation of our own housing agency in Nova Scotia. I'm just wondering if anyone had any questions they'd like to pose for either Evelyn or Emmanuel, and also would like to welcome those watching on the web if they have any questions they'd like to submit. Duncan?
Great presentation. Thank you. There was a figure put up there about for every $1 investment on behalf of the government, there was a $2.3 return. Do you have a sense of the public versus private difference in that makes up that 2.3?
It's mostly public because c'est les autres contributions.
The additional contributions would be CMHC and municipalities. If there's private participation, I wouldn't have the detailed information, but it's mostly public. Yes.
John?
Evelyn, what was the response to the report when it was released?
The report was very well received by decision makers. As I mentioned earlier, it was to raise awareness of decision makers to the fact that housing must be a priority for investment. It was very well welcomed, and the impact study was presented in Europe, in the context of other conferences in other provinces of Canada. And it's a study that did indeed raise awareness of Canadians with regard to social housing and its impact. So it allowed us to get additional monies for our work. In brief, that was the big plus. Thank you.
Same question John had asked as well, how it was received and whether it resulted in new money for the SHQ. So, Ian?
Yes, hi. Thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. Ian Melzer, CMHC. I'm putting two numbers together from two different slides. I don't know if I'm doing this fairly or not. But on one slide, you talk about the subsidies paid totaling $608 million. And then on the slide that talked about less poverty, you talked about additional expenditures for various essential goods of $152 million. So is it the case that $152 million is part of the $608 million? And if so, do you have any idea where the rest of the money went? Would some of it go to education, or what other things?
It's part of it, but it's actually no. Within the $608 million, you have more than just the programs HLM and PSL. Maybe I should speak French. So only part of this $608 million actually goes into what was quantified for poverty for the HLM and PSL projects. This 52 million, it's not all that was given. It's about half of what was given. Actually, that's your question. Like for subsidies of about twice that, half of it goes into food, transportation, and clothing.
So the question is, where does the other half go?
Well, we didn't quantify that. Yeah, we limited it to the essential needs. It can go into a bunch of other things, but we didn't quantify that. Yeah. But it was more, we wanted to demonstrate that, yes, it in fact increases their spending in essential needs.
Hi, Ariel Stockdale, Nunavut Housing Corporation. You mentioned that Nunavik is very different, as we know. So I'm wondering if there were limitations in terms of your results and what you were able to do.
En fait, je vais parler en français.
I'll speak French. It's easier for me. It limited us to the extent that we weren't able to carry out the same exercise with regard to the expenses avoided in the absence of the SHQ, because there was no comparison basis. There was no plausible scenario with no SHQ. We couldn't imagine that people, I'm inventing here, but we couldn't imagine that people would be living in igloos or teepees. We decided to not do that exercise because it would have been too invented, improvised. I don't have the results, but we did do a review of the literature on this issue. So there are results that have already been published in other studies, and we do mention this in our report, but we didn't carry out that exercise ourselves because of those limits that are just too major. But the studies, the documents that Evelyn brought, we have copies here. The complete studies are available on the SHQ's website.
Matthew Mike at Manitoba Housing and Community Development. Fantastic presentation, fantastic work. So much so that, I start thinking of how I can use similar work to get more money in my own jurisdiction. So that I start wondering, how long did the research take, and how much did the research cost?
The cost, actually, I'll let Evelyn, but we did it in about 6 months. But I have to say that every time we met with a researcher or an expert on each of the theme, it didn't seem realistic for them. And for them, it would have, for each individual theme would have taken at least 2 years to, and I agreed with that. So this is, I would say it's a first view of what can be done, but it doesn't go as in depth as we could go. So yeah, we did it in 6 months, and I'll let Evelyn, because the actual cost I'm not really aware, and I don't know if you are.
Non, présentement, j'ai pas.
No, at present I don't have an idea of the exact cost. I would invite you to get in touch with us if you're interested in carrying out a similar type of study. We would be delighted to help you. If you give us a call, I'd be delighted to provide the information to you. I don't have that data with me here.
Okay, seeing no further questions, I would like to thank again Evelyn and Emmanuel for their presentation.